Hi, this is Stacy, the baby maker Roberts. I have put together more than a decade of my clinical experience into developing the first online mentoring program that deals with the ever-growing area of natural fertility. My Baby Maker Network Mentoring Program is an online interactive program where you will learn how to address all aspects of fertility issues. If you are ready to be a part of an atmosphere that helps you build your practice while helping couples build their family, I look forward to getting to know you in the Baby Maker Mentoring Program. Please go to bioceuticals.com.au and click on the Education tab for more information and to register.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. And joining me on the line today is Dr. Liza Oates. Now, Liza is a naturopathic practitioner and mentor based at Malvern Natural Healthcare in Victoria. Her doctoral research investigated the health and wellness effects of organic diets. As part of this research, she developed innovative dietary assessment tools, ran organic consumer surveys and tested the level of pesticide residues in the urine of adults who consume organic compared to conventional foods. She's presented the findings at conferences in Australia, Poland, South Korea and the Czech Republic, and we'll be discussing food toxicants at the ACNEM conference in Sydney on May the 1st, 2016. In 2007, Liza developed the Food as Medicine course for the postgraduate wellness program at RMIT University in Melbourne. She's the course coordinator and lecturer for Food as Medicine and wellness practices and perspectives at RMIT and supervises naturopathic students, clinics at Endeavour College of Natural Health and Southern School of Natural Therapies. She's taught nutrition, complementary medicine in chronic diseases and health enhancement to naturopathic and medical students. Liza has appeared as an expert guest on Insight and The Project and is a contributing author to the Herbs and Natural Supplements, an evidence-based guide, all 4 editions I might add, by Leslie Braun and Mark Cohen, as well as complementary therapies and the management of diabetes and vascular disease, and has published over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles. Liza, welcome to FX Medicine. Boy, that's a heck of a lot you've been up to. I think you need a life.
I think I do. Sounds awful when you read it all out like that.
Not the least was, I think you need kudos points for measuring the urine of these people. So well done to you.
Thank you.
I used to always say, jeepers, I don't want to ever be a Swedish researcher, these people that smell armpits to look at their sweat and things like that.
Yeah, indeed.
Now, you've done research, clinical work. You've also done a heck of a lot of lecturing and mentorship for natural medicine practitioners. Where did this all start for you?
Oh, gosh. I guess like many natural health practitioners, I started off with my own health crises when I was in my early 20s. And I was fortunate enough to have an integrative doctor who sort of headed me in the right direction. And, you know, over the years, I decided to have a little life change and study to become a naturopath. And after I graduated, I found myself teaching food as medicine, which is a topic I'm extremely passionate about. A bit of a foodie. And then when it sort of came time to look at a PhD topic, I initially started looking at detoxification. And when I started my literature review, I went, this is not going to work. There's just actually not enough out there to base a thesis on. So I started to actually think about what I did myself when I was doing detoxification programs with patients. And the cornerstone for me was always an organic diet, actually reducing the number of toxins going in. And so that's sort of how the PhD led off onto actually looking at how we could measure toxins in organic versus conventional consumers as a way to sort of one day further down the track see what we can do about getting rid of them.
Okay, so one of the issues of pesticides, let's say, is indeed what to measure because they're short-term, but their effects aren't necessarily short-term. So am I right in thinking that there's well-described surrogate markers for toxic overload that we should be measuring?
Not particularly. I mean, when you think about it, there are thousands of different chemicals that we can be talking about. In our studies, we measured metabolites of organophosphates. So the reason we chose to do these are DAPs or dialkyl phosphate metabolites, and the reason we chose to do those was because they're represented about 80% of organophosphates, and organophosphates are sort of one of the major classes of pesticides that are used. But there are so many other different pesticides, and when you actually look at the testing, a lot of it's not particularly well developed. Some of the tests will actually pick up things that aren't even pesticides. So there's not a lot of really good testing in this area. So you sort of need to sort of be looking at, if you're looking for a particular chemical that you want to test for, there are sometimes things available. But in terms of something broad that's going to give you a good idea of somebody's toxic load, that's a lot more complicated.
Right. And I think you need to really go through in depth into your research, because when you're looking at organic foods as a means to reduce toxins, it's a pretty broad brushstroke, because toxins can come from so many different sources. So could you take our listeners through what you did and, the variants that occurred, all that sort of thing?
Yeah. So in our study, we were specifically looking at organophosphate pesticides because, as I said, they are one of the sort of bigger classes of pesticides that are used. So basically what we did, we had a group of participants who, and we did a crossover study. So the participants were on a largely organic diet for 7 days. So when I say largely organic, we insisted that it was at least 80% organic, and we had, dietary surveys and things to actually assess that. Yep. And then the same participants completed a conventional diet, so eating the same sorts of foods, but conventional foods for another 7 days. So at the end of each of those periods, we measured their urine and we tested these dialkyl phosphate metabolites. And what we found was that on average, they reduced about 90% within that 7 day period. Wow. So some people did the conventional phase first and then the organic, and some people did it the other way around. Yeah. But as a general rule, there was a 90% reduction, which sort of confirms what we know about these pesticides, is that they are relatively quick in and out of the system.
Okay, so I'm just thinking about how you'd set up that trial, and I thought about, well, okay, people who choose to eat an organic diet usually do so quite with strong conviction, and so they'd be extremely reticent to then say, eat all the chemicals now. Yes, so I'm imagining that you would be choosing people that would ordinarily eat an everyday pesticide-laden diet and then instruct them to eat an organic diet. Would that be right?
Well, we had people who were prepared to do both, basically. Right. So we had people who actually did consume some organic food, so they knew where to source it, and they were sort of familiar with how to actually, choose certified organic produce, and it had to be certified at 80%. Yeah. So we basically we recruited them from places like farmers markets and things where people are a little bit more savvy about their food. So it made it a bit easier, but they had to all be prepared to actually consume a fully conventional diet for at least 7 days. So they weren't the absolute diehards. Mm. And we didn't recruit anyone from regional areas or pregnant women or that sort of thing, which would have complicated the issue a bit.
Yeah. And sorry, and something else has just popped into my brain. I'm just thinking about trying to take out variants, and this comes to mind because of a rather embarrassing story when I first moved to Brisbane of the quote unquote organic market, which was found out not to be selling organic food at all.
Oops.
Yeah, big oops. So did you test any of the organic food to make sure that it was actually organic?
No, we didn't in this case. There are some studies that have been done in the United States where they did that to confirm, but they actually provided the participants with the food. Yep. We weren't financially in a position to do that, but we did record everything that they ate and drank, and to be classified as organic, it had to be certified organic, so it actually had to have
certification.
We gave them pictures of all the organic certification logos.
I think that would be the differential, because this was not organically certified. These foods were just sold as touted, written on the sign organic, and they weren't.
Organic doesn't always mean organic. Yeah. I mean, I think to be sure you really do need to go for the certified organic products.
And Okay, another one that's coming to mind. I'm sorry here. But with certification of organic fruit and vegetables, are there peak bodies? How many? Is there heaps? Or?
Yeah. So, there are a few in Australia. Basically, we have a couple of sort of levels. So we have the Australian standards for organic and biodynamic produce. So these are the government regulations. So these were initially developed by the Australian Quarantine and Inspection Service. So they're really actually to protect the export market more than anything.
Yep.
So there's this overlying kind of standard that all of the certifiers have to adhere to. But there are really two main certifiers in Australia. So they represent over 90% of the market. And they're both non-for-profit organisations. That's Australian Certified Organic and NASA. So those two organisations, there's actually about another 6, but they're minor organisations that don't cover as much of the market and tend to be more involved in the export market than the domestic market. So these larger bodies, they have their own certification standards as well. So they have to at least adhere to the Australian standards, but mostly their requirements are actually even stricter than the legal requirements.
Oh,
so
okay. That's good news.
Yeah. So, for instance, the standard allows something to be called organic as long as there's not a level of a particular chemical above 10% of the maximum residue limit, whereas a lot of the certifying bodies will actually say, well, 10% is way too much, and they might set the standard, their standard at 5%, or they might have zero tolerance for certain things. So those sorts of things will vary sometimes between different certification organisations, but they all have to adhere to that sort of overarching standard as the minimum requirement.
And I think that bodes well for the research, because it means you're getting a wider difference between the toxic load and the organic food, so you can actually see a clearer difference. Yeah.
Yeah, so they do testing, and if something actually is found for any reason to be over 10% of the MRL, the maximum residue limit, they actually have to recall it. They have to do a public recall.
Oh, that's good.
But that practically never has to happen because they're onto things before they get that far.
So here's the bad news: is if you're not buying organic food, you're buying up to 20 times what you should have been buying.
Well, I guess so, yeah.
That's the reverse, isn't
That's
it?
That's another way to look at it, yeah.
Yeah, it's the glass half empty thing. So, Liza, I have to ask you, this has been covered a long time ago with regards to persistent organochlorine pollutants. But what about the combined effects of pesticides and other toxicants?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the big concerns because, I think the regulatory bodies do their best to regulate foods to make sure they're safe for consumption, but there are so many different complicating factors, and one of them is the unpredictable nature of cocktails of chemicals.
Yeah.
So to give you an example, there are some studies done. They were actually done in salmon, but where they looked at organophosphate pesticides and carbamate pesticides. Now, both of these classes of chemicals are both acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. So they were looking at the combined effects of these chemicals. And what they found was it wasn't a simple additive effect. There was actually a synergistic effect when you started to combine those chemicals that had similar effects. So some of the salmon actually died at levels that they shouldn't have if you actually just worked on a basic addition calculation. And the others actually had earlier signs of acetylcholinesterase inhibition. So,
really?
The sorts of things that we see in practice all the time, an over-exaggerated startle response and excess mucus production, and I think there were listless and things like that as well. So how you test that in a salmon, I'm not exactly sure, but they've obviously got ways to do it. But yeah, certainly the effects of chemicals of mixtures can become really complicated. And when you consider how many chemicals are out there, so, we're just talking about pesticides, which is, just one of the classes of agricultural and veterinary chemicals that might turn up in our food sources. But we're exposed to chemicals through what we eat, through what we drink, what we put on our skin, what we inhale. So there are, over 100 million chemicals registered in the world.
Oh, my God.
The combined, not all of them are actually currently in use, but there are certainly a lot that are. And so trying to actually work out how those things are all going to interact is really difficult. So, it's not always 1 + 1 = 2. It might be 1 + 1 = 42.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to actually predict how those things might actually come together to work. And even individual chemicals don't respond the same way in different environments, at different temperatures, different pH, all sorts of things affects the way a chemical will behave.
So I guess that really comes down to you've got to observe your patient at that time, presenting with what they present with and support them through that. It's not just a broad brushstroke saying this chemical is treated this way.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's where you've got to do a good clinical history, but also recognise that most of your patients have no idea what they're actually exposed to. Yeah. It's not like you pick up an apple and a little, label pops out that says you've been exposed to X number of parts per million of chlorpyrifos and X number of parts per billion of, whatever pesticides. So, there's a lot of controversy about, linking pesticides with health concerns. But when you think about it, how could you even do that? How can you do that on a large scale? It's not like a pharmaceutical drug. If you're taking a pharmaceutical drug, it's been tested on humans, which is not done with pesticides because it's kind of considered to be unethical, which is ironic.
Which is ironic.
We can put it in the food chain, but heaven forbid we actually, test it on human beings. So it gets into the food chain and there's very little post-market surveillance. Whereas with a pharmaceutical, there's the human testing that's done before. The person knows exactly what they're taking, exactly what dose, over what period of time. The practitioner can kind of see if something starts to change when they start to take this medication, that something's not quite right. There are formal ways that they can report that, and if enough data collects together, they start to look closer at something, and eventually they might even take it off the market.
And even with that sometimes takes decades.
Correct, it does.
If we look at the issues with, Vioxx was a quick reaction, but if we look at things like thalidomide was an early one and probably not appropriate. What was it? Lovastatin. That took years to get off the market.
Yeah.
Because of
when you
safety
think
concerns.
about it, cigarette smoking, they started to talk about the deleterious effects of cigarette smoking in the 20s and 30s, and we're still fighting that battle.
Yeah. So when you're talking about the healthy foods, I think the general term that most people would say was, our fresh fruit and vegetables are fresh, and so they're good for you, and that's not always the case.
They are good for you. Look, they are good for you. And I would never say to someone, eat less fruit and vegetables. And, this is often a criticism when people start to talk about organic food and reducing pesticide exposure. The assumption is that people are therefore going to consume less fruit and vegetables, which is complete rubbish, of course, because when we actually look at organic consumers, which we've done, organic consumers tend to actually eat a lot more fruit and vegetables than the average person. And part of that is also when people move to an organic diet, and we've seen this in our research, when people move to an organic diet, they tend to make other dietary changes as well. And one is that they will tend to reduce their meat consumption. And that's probably a financial thing as much as anything else. Yeah. But they also get closer to the source. To actually source their organic foods, they're a little bit more inclined to, maybe go to farmers to get sort of better prices and things like that. And so they're actually getting food that they're consuming a lot closer to harvest and that hasn't been through, long periods of storage or transport or whatever. Yep. So the nutritional value of that food is probably higher from that point of view anyway. The overall, I certainly would never say consume less fruit and vegetables because you should be concerned about pesticides. Consume lots of fruit and vegetables, but still be a bit concerned about the pesticides. And the way to get both is to, go organic as much as you can, reasonably
feasible.
Afford.
Yeah. In opposition to some of these detractors for the organic diet who say that there's no point in doing it, I think it would, as long as it's practical, it's actually very useful. But can you comment on some of that negative writing that was done? I think I remember one in Scientific American.
Yeah, I think that article came out a few years ago. Very authoritative source, that one. I think it was Master Chef Wilcox from memory. And she talked about quite a number of different issues. And, you know, to be fair, there was a little bit of cherry picking going on. She did cite some interesting articles. But I think one of the important things to remember is that the patterns of use are very different from region to region. So she was talking about what was happening in the United States. Say, here in Australia, for instance, our standards are a little bit different. Our patterns of use are a little bit different. So she talked about things like copper, which, yes, copper is used in organic farming, but it's actually much more restricted in organic farming than it is in conventional farming. She talked about pyrethrins, which, yes, they're potentially used in organic farming, but they tend not to be. And one of the reasons is because they don't really work. There's actually an adjuvant that's added to pyrethrins to actually make them more toxic, so they actually work, and that's banned in organic farming.
Right. So
they tend not to actually use them because they're not effective enough.
Yeah.
And there was another one, retinone, which is almost, I think the organic industry is actually trying to have that removed from the standard at the moment because they realised that there was information coming out to say that, you know, it wasn't particularly a good thing to be using. So at this stage, I think the major certifying body, which is Australian Certified Organic, has pretty much banned its use amongst its growers. I think it's maybe down to one use, which is a topical use in sheep or something like that.
Right.
But they've pretty much got it out of the system in Australia. So some of those concerns are not really relevant, say, to us here in Australia, and different patterns of use in different countries. Similarly, you know, you look at something like the Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen Clean 15 list.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's great if you live in the United States, but we don't have the same amount of data to actually to inform a list like that in Australia. But the best data that we have is from FSANZ, and that's the Australian Total Diet Survey. So they did pesticides a few years ago, and if you look at their data versus the Environmental Working Group's data, there's actually a lot of differences. So in terms of the Dirty Dozen list, about half of those foods weren't even tested in the Australian data. And the other half, yes, they would deserve to be on that Dirty Dozen list. But then you look at their Clean 15 list, only two of the foods that turn up on their Clean 15 list, which is sweet peas and onions, were also detected as being low in the Australian Total Diet Survey. There was probably about 7 that weren't done in Australia, and then there are 6 that actually the Australian Total Diet Survey showed had residues of certain things. So we probably wouldn't have those things on our Clean 15 list if we had enough data to put them together. So there were things like avocados, pineapples, cabbage, mangoes, kiwi and cauliflower. Yeah. But then there are some other foods that might be contenders to go on the Dirty Dozen list that weren't on the American list. So things like broccoli and lettuce and mushrooms and oranges and those sorts of things. So I do think we've got to be really clear about what region we're looking at when we're reading these sorts of articles, because there can be huge differences in the patterns of use.
So practically, if you're talking about pesticides, and I notice you just mentioned broccoli there that should go in the Dirty Dozen, some people were talking, it was a few years ago now, talking about you should always wash your broccoli because the pesticide residues are on them. Are they only on them, or can they be in the foods?
No, they'll also be translocated into the food. So washing, scrubbing, peeling can get rid of some pesticides, but not all. Yep. A lot of pesticides are designed to actually move into the actual food, and that's where they sort of exert their effect. So washing won't get rid of everything, and peeling, you're then also losing a lot of the nutritional value as well. So it sort of depends on the food, and there's not really enough data to say which ones you need to you can get away with just peeling or washing, and which ones you can't, because there's just not enough research in that area at the moment.
I'd like to see somebody try and peel broccoli.
Yeah, well, see, one of the problems with things like broccoli is it has such an enormous surface area.
Yes.
So you spray something on broccoli, you know, it's not far to be absorbed.
Yeah. When you're talking about practical interventions, recommendations that let's say for most people, try and source a farmer's market, try and wash things if you can't get them, but knowing that it's not really going to
it's not a guarantee.
It's not a guarantee. Yeah. Anything else? Other practical interventions?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, and obviously, organic is an area of passion for me, so I'm always going to say, as much as reasonably possible, go organic. And I say that to recognising that there is a price premium for organic, but also noting that the average Australian household spends only about $20 a week on fruit and vegetables. So I think, when we consider what we spend on mobile phones and pay TV and internet services
it's amazing, isn't it?
And other things, I think sometimes, if it's a priority for you and, when we look at the data, income is not necessarily that much of a determinant of the amount of organic produce that people actually purchase. So if it's a priority for people, even on a low income, sometimes they'll find ways to make it happen. And this is where things like farmers markets can be useful. Also, it's fresher. The nutrients are likely to be higher. It hasn't gone through, the transport and storage and that sort of thing. So trying to get close to the source of production and the time of harvest, I think, is very useful as well. So that's where buying local things that can be handy. Grow what you can.
I was just going to ask this question.
Having said that, don't grow it in your backyard soil because you do not know what's in there.
Yeah.
For instance, if I go out into my yard and dig down about 3 centimetres, I start to get building rubble.
Yeah.
So unless you've had your soil tested or you're really confident that your soil is clean, I would say get yourself some organic mulch and put it, in some pots and actually grow it separately. But,
and build it up.
Most people, even indoors, I've lived in apartments where I've grown lettuce or leafy greens in some pots on the windowsill. Yeah. So there's often some things you can do to sort of supplement by growing your own, but do be careful about, anything you grow at home. So read food labels. So this isn't going to get you away from pesticides per se, but certainly some of the other chemicals your food could be exposed to.
Yeah. And I always advocate the use of a physical barrier. And yes, it's plastic, but the builder's plastic, forgive me, 200 micron one, the thicker one. Yes, I know it's plastic, but I think you've just got to make a choice as to what's practical. You could then line it with other things, I guess.
Yeah, I have a lovely, thing that's sort of and I'm quite short, so it's quite easy to get to.
And you can get organic soil quite readily these days.
Yeah, you can.
Use your own worms, all of that sort of thing,
Correct. I think this is an important thing to remember about organic too is, often it gets bogged down in thinking about organic as just being a system that doesn't use chemicals. But in actual fact, if you talk to an organic farmer, they'll barely even mention chemicals. They're not really that interested in them. What they're interested in is the soil. They get very excited about soil. Wow. And they can, bang on for hours about the health of the soil because the basic principles of organic farming are health, ecology, fairness and care. And it's all about creating a healthy environment. So you create healthy soil, you build up the soil organic matter. Anything that grows in that soil is going to be healthy. Anything that eats that plant is going to be healthier. So it all comes back to sort of nourishing the soil and building it up and making it this rich environment of microbes and nutrients and everything.
And you've just touched on it's a whole subject in itself is the microbes in the soil affecting the health of what grows in it. That's a massive subject, that one.
I think we also need to, when we talk about pesticides, we also need to remember that, some of those pesticides like glyphosate is an antibiotic. It's going to have negative effects on the microbiome. So, it's not just the chemicals themselves.
Yeah.
And something like glyphosate itself is not necessarily that toxic, although there's a lot of controversy at the moment about it being a potential carcinogen. But it's actually sometimes the problem is the mixtures. We don't actually just use glyphosate on its own. We use it as a mixture. And some of those adjuvants that are added to it actually change how toxic that product might be, or some of its environmental breakdown products. So we're not just actually dealing with that individual chemical. In risk assessment, individual chemicals are assessed for risk,
right.
but the reality is that's not how we actually are exposed to
No,
it.
that's right. That's exactly right. So I've got to ask then, sometimes we're going to be talking about these vague symptoms and how can somebody measure the benefit apart from saying, yes, we measured less of these chemicals in their blood or the urine. What other health benefits can they find? Like from what symptoms to what health benefits?
Yeah, so we did a survey a few years ago, and we had well over 400 people respond to it. So these were people who were organic consumers, and we basically it was an exploratory study. So I'm not saying that organic food, we've demonstrated that it definitely has these effects, but we were interested in what the organic consumers reported.
Yeah.
So after they moved to an organic diet, the key things that tended to come up again and again were improved resistance to and recovery from illness, so not getting sick as often. When they did get sick, they got better quicker, more energy, better condition of skin, hair and nails, more mentally alert, better mood stability. And another one I thought was interesting was a better sense of satiety. People felt that when they consumed organic foods, they actually felt more satisfied by them. And I have to say, I noticed that myself. If I go out into, and I think partly this is the freshness as well, but if I go out into my garden and pick my organic lettuce and bring it in, I feel so satisfied. Like it just feels so much more satisfying.
Yeah.
And I think we need to consider that, like the mind-body effects of consuming something that's in line with our values as well. So, organic consumers, when we ask them about why they consume organic foods, the automatic assumption is that people are prepared to pay that price premium for their own individual health. But the thing that actually comes up higher is our environmental concerns, because people are sort of aware that their own individual health is also dependent on the health of the planet. So I think, when people put their money where their mouth is, or, what's the Michael Pollan comment about voting with your fork? There's actually, I think there's a mind-body benefit that comes with that as well in terms of well-being. So some people might call that a placebo effect, but I actually wouldn't discount that. I think it tells us how powerful the healing effect of the mind is.
Oh, absolutely. Just going back to one of your comments there about that joy that you have about bringing the food to your plate sort of thing. I was talking to a friend the other day about this, and I remember firstly growing, when I was a kid, growing veggies in our backyard, the beans, the radishes. It's when I fell in love with radishes. Carrots.
I love a good radish.
Yeah, carrots and things like that. And you'd rip them out of the ground. The beans especially, you'd rip them off the vine, open them up, eat the beans or the peas, and they'd never make it to the table. You ate raw veggies. Yeah, no. You'd pick the carrots out of the ground, brush off the dirt and eat it. There was no washing. I used to love that. And my sister, who has a potty farm, and she grows her own veggies, and she has a thriving berry bushes, these beautiful berries. And so we used to go down and just attack them.
If you could get to them first.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. But me and my sons, they got a true joy for that. I'll always remember my sons when they were younger, just getting that real man, I love berries.
Well, this is the thing, though. I think, if we can get kids involved in growing produce, kids will eat things they've grown themselves.
Yeah.
And it might be something as simple as sprouting. If you can get kids involved in growing food and producing healthy foods, they're much more open to actually trying it and consuming it. And, hey, if you're talking about the nutritional value, it can't be much better than when you pull it straight off the vine and into your gob.
That's right. That's exactly right. All salient points. I've got to say, I'm so refreshed that you've done this research. I've got to ask you, is there any further research that you're looking at with organic foods?
Ooh, is it secret? Maybe it's secret.
Okay.
Yes, we are. So at RMIT, we do have some other studies coming up.
Yeah.
So Lauren Burns, who most people will be familiar with, she was the Taekwondo Olympic gold medalist at the 2000 Olympics. She's doing some research with her as part of her master's. So she's going to be looking at organic food in athletes.
So we will
that'll
watch
be
this
pretty
space.
Exciting. Yeah, absolutely.
So Lauren Burns.
Yes. So we're, I think the ethics approval is just pretty much through for that now. So that'll be an interesting watch this space.
Yes.
And there's some other things on the agenda there as well. So it will be quite interesting to see what comes out in the future.
Good stuff, Liza. Thank you so much for taking us through that. No, it's really opened my eyes as to, we take so much from overseas experts and they just may not be, in fact often aren't, applicable to Australian practices. That was an eye-opener for me. But also the simple things that we can do to improve our lifestyle, eating organic veggies and fruit.
Yeah, and just getting more involved with your food, whether it's growing it yourself or chatting to the person who actually grew it and asking them what they did with it.
Brilliant, Liza. Thank you so much for joining us on FX Medicine.
Thanks, Andrew.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield-Cook. This is Andrew from FX Medicine. We thank you so much for your support over the last 2 years. We'd really love to remain clinically relevant to your practice. So if you know of an expert in some area, please let us know. You can contact us on fxmedicine.com.au, Facebook or Twitter.